Okay, so that's good. All right, I hope that's working. Yes. Awesome. Fantastic. Okay, so chapter 1, psychological research. And of course, this thing doesn't work. I'm gonna, technology, help me, please. Yes, okay. So in this class, and a little bit in this chapter, we're gonna give you step-by-step processes on how to design and kind of understand research in psychology. We talk about the purpose of research, the types of questions that psychologists ask, right? I think there was at least like one person in here who wanted to do research, right? Who was it? Was it you? You're like, yeah. Oh, okay. And she's not here. Well, there that goes. Okay, so types of questions that psychologists ask, the methods in which they use to answer them, and how researchers describe their findings. And you guys will kind of participate in that process too, right? Trying to come up with research questions, figure out how to write APA reports and things like that, because that's how we do it. So when we get to writing an APA paper, for example, that's literally what I do in my kind of everyday job. I write APA types of papers. Okay. Okay. All right. So why should you care about research? If you don't want to do research as a career. It's kind of weird because most of us do some parts of research in our everyday life, I think, regardless of what job you have. But one of the first main reasons is that you use knowledge from research studies. Okay, so for example, when you go to a restaurant and you pay for your meal with a credit card, let's say nowadays, most of the time, it's like on some type of iPad thing, right? You scan your card and then it pops up and it gives you tips, options for giving a tip, right? Some places, so they always give you an option to customize your tip, right? Some places will start at 12%, 15%, 18%. Some places will go 15, 18, 20, right? So the places that start higher, right, generally tend to make more money in tips because people usually like kind of default settings, right? Most people don't sit there and hit custom and type in a number, right? Like how many of you guys have sat there and done like a custom tip? Oh, look at you guys. Why have you done that in the past? You just like round numbers, right? Like you don't want to tip 503, you want to tip $5. Okay, fair enough. How about you? Why have you done it? Yeah. So you customize because you probably tip more than what's suggested, probably. Yeah, it really depends on the service. And you actually tip based on the service. Okay. Well, I hope dinner is still enjoyable for you. You're not sitting there going like, oh, what's this? What's that? Why else? Why else have you guys customized your tips? What is that? Oh, okay. You want a tip based on the service. Okay. Good. So probably some time ago, someone has dedicated a significant amount of money to figuring out like how do we get people to tip a lot of money, right? And they figured out that by setting defaults for people are more likely to tip the defaults than to customize the tips yourself. Okay. Another example, most of services you get, for example, your cable company will offer you an introductory offer that's like $50 off. And after 3 months, it kicks it up, right? Or my wife did this recently. someone offered her one of those like food prep services. You guys know what I'm talking about? They send like meals in boxes and you have to cook them up. Yeah, like HelloFresh. I think that's what it was. This past. So they go, hey, first week is free, right? All you have to do is pay for shipping. And then we'll automatically send you foods every week unless you tell us not to. Right. Oh, a whole month. Maybe it was a month. I don't know. The thing is, most people forget for the cable services, for other things, and that's how they make their money. Somewhere along the line, someone came along and figured out that we are pretty lazy and we tend to forget things, right? So like that uses knowledge of research that maybe you haven't even thought of, but certainly there are people out there who have thought about it for you, right? Yeah, so my wife is usually pretty good too, but apparently with HelloFresh, they pretty much send it like right away. So it was like $100. I was like, well, groceries, we could buy a lot of groceries. Anyways, and she's like, I'm so sorry. I was like, sure you are. We all know that's how it works, right? What other, so for example, when you go to the grocery, the supermarket, right? Things are put at eye level for very specific reasons, right? Like, and if you're at checkout, they always put stupid kid stuff up there because they know kids are gonna blow up and try to get you, right? Huh? Yes, right? But research, right? It's not like, oh, it's random. It's not random, right? People have gone through and studied what makes people buy things, and people tend to buy things that are more at their eye level and so on, right? So even though you don't want to do, if you don't want to do research for a living, right, it's important to understand how to use research and also understand how research is being used against you. Right? I think one of the more fascinating findings is related to that default thing. People usually do the default, right? They just go with it. In the United States, if you want to be an organ donor, what do you have to do? Yeah. So when you're doing your license thing, they go, do you want to be an organ donor? You have to check yes, right? In most European countries, they assume that you are an organ donor and you can opt out if you want. Okay, so when you're getting your license, they assume that yes, you're going to be an organ donor, and you can uncheck to not be an organ donor, right? And that's all it takes. Their rate of organ donor positives are significantly higher than ours, and that's all it takes. Is that difference? It's just that default. People tend to go with the default. It's that easy, right? So having an understanding of how research is used, right? In terms of how you can use it and also how it's being used against you, it's really important, right? Helps us know about behavior in our everyday lives, right? Helps in effective evaluation to aid in practice. So those are kind of like more marketing examples, but if you become a school psychologist, for example, research is used to figure out like who qualifies for what types of services, right? So by the way, if you don't know what you want to be, really look into school psychology, right? These folks test students to figure out if they need special services at school, for example, ADHD or dyslexia. Is that right? Is that, yeah, okay. So I think so. You can get a doctorate or you can get a master's degree to do it. Some states allow you to just have a master's. I think Texas might be one of them. Our Lady of the Lake has a program. Anyway, school psychologists, it's like 100% employment rate, and they make a really, really good living, right? But they, yes, it's very good to know. I wish I knew about it when I was in undergrad. I might have gone school psychology. It's just very rare where you go into an industry where if you get a degree, you know you're going to get a job, and a high paying job, right? The same way with speech language pathology, right? Or speech specialists is what they call them. Yeah, speech therapists. My wife does that. And so like she has a job. She works with students in California. She does all like online stuff, right? Even though she has a job, literally like every day people are calling her to offer her jobs. It's insane. She works part-time, 2 days a week. I think she makes like $50 an hour or something like that, maybe more. I think that's a lot of money. I'm sure you know people who make a lot more, but I think $50 is a lot of money, right? Right. Yeah. Yeah. So actually, I think $50 works out to be more than $100,000 if you work full time for a year. She doesn't. I'm like, please work full time. Like, why am I saying all these things? And recording them. She won't listen, right? Like, but that's another career that like I think you should really consider. Speech language pathology, especially if you speak Spanish. I think like they pay like times and a half if you speak Spanish. This is how much of a high demand job it is. Oh my God, why am I telling these stories? I had a friend who was a speech language pathologist. He worked in the schools. And one day he was so overwhelmed, he just like locked himself in his closet in his classroom so no one could find him. Obviously they fired him, right? Like obviously, but like within the next week he was hired again. Like if you have that degree, it's just it's really it's in high demand. It pays really well. Obviously you're doing something kind of meaningful for the world as well, right? So but they use research all the time, right? You know, if they test a kid, you know, they try to get them into certain percentiles. If you're in this percentile, you get X number of hours of services. If you're in this percentile, X number. If you're here, then you don't require services anymore. So lots and lots of research, right? It helps to aid in their practice. And that's a speech language example, but also like for, you know, screening for ADHD, depression, or whatever, just tons of research, right? That informs practice. And helps address issues in everyday life, okay? Also knowing research helps you interpret media reports, okay? We're just constantly being inundated with information, right? So it helps for us to be able to evaluate the quality of information that we see. Right? So for example, to know which one's an experiment, which one's a survey, right? Knowing that one is an experiment is important because you can make causal attributions, and we'll make more about we'll talk more about that issue. Okay. And just understanding research in general will help you decipher and decide what research is quality and what research is reliable. Okay. Research has the power to really turn the tides, both positively and negatively, right? I think, you know, some really strong examples of bad research, you know, like, so there was the one paper that demonstrated like a relationship between vaccines and on autism. The data was fabricated, right? He admitted to fabricating this data. They retracted the paper years ago, but it continues to be discussed, right? People continue to talk about because of that one really terrible piece of research, right? I think early on in the COVID pandemic, there was a paper that like demonstrated the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine, right, and treating COVID. And that paper was very quickly retracted, but once it got out there, just burned like wildfire, right? So it's important for you as sort of consumers of information to understand the type of research, right, that's being available. Okay. Okay, so I showed you guys the slide last time, but why do psychologists, and it's not just psychologists, because that kind of, just people in psychology, when it says psychologists there, just know that it's not like you have to have a PhD to do research, right? It's just the term we refer to in this context in terms of psychology researchers. So different ways of knowing, we know things by intuition, right? It feels right or it feels wrong. Usually not the best way to approach a decision, but we do it a lot, right? Not always the best way, but we use it a lot. Deduction, so knowing, the example here is if you're trying to figure out which way you're going, if the sun is setting that way, then that's the west, right? If the sun's rising, that's the east, and you can deduct based on which way you're looking, or which way the sun's rising or setting, which way you're looking. We talked about knowing information because of authority figures. Sometimes it's good, but I think sometimes it's super overrated. Right? Like a figure right now in the sort of information landscape is like Dr. Fauci. What's his first name? Is it Larry? It's Anthony. Larry. Sorry. My bad. But like people make such a big deal out of him, but he's just a communicator of information. It could literally be anyone, right? So instead of looking at him as a figure, as an authority figure, look at assess the information that's being provided, right? Instead of looking at the person. But of course, it's easier to judge a person than it is to dig up information, right? To actually look up the research. And so that's why a lot of kind of authority figures get demonized or whatever else. Demonized or celebrated, right? Okay. In science, we tend to use a lot of observations. Last time we talked about maybe one or two observations, not the best source of information, right? But if we can observe a lot of things, right, and keep a record of a lot of things that are happening, that might get us closer to the truth that we want to know. So that's what we talk about in science a lot, is that we try to understand and gather information through the process of observation. So the tricky thing is, though, that not all things can be observed, right? And that's the really hard thing about psychology. Right? So people will come and argue that psychology, is not a real science or whatever, or it's an easy science. To me, in many ways, it's a lot harder to measure someone's attitude, right? Like measure someone's attitude towards, homosexuality than it is to measure, I don't know, hydrogen or oxygen, right? Those things are constant. Hydrogen is this is how much it weighs, this is how it behaves. I don't know, attitudes change, attitudes shift, attitudes depend on context, right? Attitudes don't always lead to behavior. And so in many ways, it's quite complex. And in psychology, we oftentimes study things that aren't directly observable. Right? Just because you help someone doesn't mean you like them. Right? So to measure liking and loving, right, things that are relatively complex requires different methods beyond direct observation. Okay? So psychologists often observe and investigate factors that influence behavior to understanding mental processes. Okay? I mean, ultimately, we study a lot of underlying causes to behaviors because we want to be able to address those behaviors, right? So if it's prejudice that we study, we try to figure out the underlying processes of prejudice so that we can reduce prejudice, right? So ultimately, we try to understand why things happen so that we can help address them. Okay? Research also is used to determine what's normal or abnormal behavior, and this is kind of tricky, right? But typically normal is defined as what's the average, right? Within some, average give or take a little bit. And then if you're outside of those averages or outside of those norms, then now that's considered to be abnormal. Right? So typically, I wish there was a whiteboard. You guys know what a bell curve looks like, right? Let me pull up one. So here's a bell curve. I'll pull it off to the side so you guys can see the slides too. I just want the picture. Can you do that for me? Nope. Thanks, internet. So here's a picture of a bell curve. It looks like a bell. So if there's something that we're interested in studying, for example, IQ, right, which kind of is a decent measure of intelligence, right? If you give everyone an IQ test, most people will score somewhere in the middle here. So that's how the average is determined. And then you have scores to the extreme, okay? These are like your Mensa folks. You guys know what Mensa is? It's like a club for really high IQ people. It's like super exclusive, right? And they ask you like IQ types of questions to help get you in, right? So for example, you guys want to be in Mensa. Here's a question, right? So you guys know manhole covers, things that cover the big, systems. Why are those things always round? Why don't you see rectangular manhole covers? Huh? Because the pipe's around, maybe. But like once you get in, the sewer system's not round, right? It's maybe squared, even rectangular. Why is the cover always a circle? It's not the pressure. Good guess. It's okay. I didn't know the answer either. I looked it up, so don't feel bad. I would pretend like I knew it all along, but I looked it up. Other questions? Or I mean, other guesses? Why do you think it's round? Oh, well, you don't know what I'm talking about? Okay. Hang on. Google, you will help me. Now I have a record of like looking up manhole cover and dear Lord, don't let this be a bad internet search. Oh, okay. Right. What is he doing? Right. So they're just like little covers that cover up like the entryway into like the underground sewer systems. Why are they always circular? Okay, maybe you can fit through it. Other guesses, just take a guess. It's fun. It's fun to be wrong. It's not. You got to embrace being wrong once in a while. Okay. Oh, easier to close. Not quite. It's easier to keep closed. Okay. That's pretty close. Not easier to make. Okay. Think about what's the worst thing that can happen to a cover? It falls through, right? So if it's a circle, no matter which shape you turn it, it's a circle, so it won't fall through. If it's a square, if you turn it sideways and you fit it, right, it's going to fall through. Boom. None of us are Mensa material. All right, that's what we determined there, right? Okay, good. So anyways, back to my other internet search. So this is a bell curve. Okay, again, so at the very extreme, you have really high scores, right? And here you have really low scores. So if you score really low on your IQ, then you're determined. It used to be called mental retardation. Now it's there's a different term for it. What's the term? Huh? So it's something like that, right? I feel terrible for not knowing the term. Yeah, somewhere along those lines. I forgot what the score was. I want to say like a 77 or something like that. That puts you in like the lower 5% of IQ scores. And that's when it's determined that you can get like different types of services to. Yeah. What is that? Thank you. I feel terrible for not knowing that. It determines sort of your intellectual ability or disability, right? So anyways, that's a great question. Let me just look up an actual IQ bell curve. Uh, 100. So that's the average score is 100, and then maybe it's 70. Maybe that's the benchmark to make that determination if you're on the lower 2%, I think. Anyways, okay. So how do we get there? Okay. Help clients deal with problem behavior. That could have been it. Okay. All right. So I guess the point of the last 3 slides is that, hey, even if you don't want to be a researcher, it's important to know research for a variety of different reasons, either for your own use on how you can use it against other people, or you can kind of see how it's being used against you, right? And a lot of things are not random the way that you think they are. They're just not. Things are well, like carefully crafted, intentional. When you go into stores, if you get onto a website, things are very intentional, and they're mostly intended for you to spend your money or your time. Okay. All right. So one of the most important concepts to understand in statistics is the idea is the difference between a population and a sample. Okay. And I'll go back to the idea of validity in a little bit, but so validity, when you talk about validity, we're talking about how valid or like how true a study result is. Okay. So sorry. The main distinctions that we need to know, and we'll talk about this later, is the difference between validity, which is how true it is, and reliability, which is how consistent something is. And we'll go back to this idea. But for right now, what we want to focus on is this idea of a population. Okay, a population consists of the people for which you want to know about. Okay, so the population could be everyone on planet Earth, right? Or your population could be everyone that's in this classroom, or population could be everyone that's at A&M San Antonio, right? It consists of the group that you want to know about, that you want to make attributions about. And a sample is a subset of that group, right? So, like Americans are a sample of the population of the whole world, right? You guys are a subset of A&M students, right? Freshmen are a sample of A&M students. It's a subset of that group. Okay? So oftentimes in research, we don't get to know the true effect of a population because they're really hard to get a hold of. So for example, you want to learn about how you want to learn of parents' attitudes towards their gay son, right? You probably can't go and talk to every single parent that has a gay son. That's pretty impossible. So what you do is you select a few parents, right? And hopefully those parents are representative of all parents that have gay sons, okay? If I want to study people who have HIV, I probably can't go and test my drug on every single person that has HIV, right? I have to take out a subset of that. I have to take a sample out, okay? And hopefully my sample looks kind of like my population, okay? Does this work as a whiteboard too, you think? Or am I going to screw some things up if I write on it? I think that might be my whiteboard right there. Okay. I think it's a smart board, and I might ruin it if I. Okay. Yeah, I don't want to mess with it. Anyways, okay. So a sample is a subset of the population, right? So another way of writing it is like if you make two small circles, sorry for people who don't have a whiteboard online. So this is it, perfect. Good times. My marker doesn't work, just for anyone who's interested in knowing what the heck is going on. Okay, so let's try this again. I bet you that's a whiteboard, right? I don't know. Okay, so if my sample, if this is my population, everyone who I'm interested in is this circle, right? If I take a small sample, right, chances are it might not be as representative of everyone, right? But if my sample, the bigger my samples gets, okay, the more likely it is going to be representative of my population. That makes sense, right? But that's not always true, right? Help me. Okay, so let's imagine now that, like, instead of people are being divided all over the place, if I'm interested in studying some type of population, but let's say that this quadrant has a lot of white people, this one has a lot of black people, this one has a lot of Asian people, this one has a lot of Latinos, okay? So sometimes I can take a very small sample and it will still be representative, right? Sometimes I take a big sample, but if I take a big sample of just one type of thing, then it's still not going to be representative of everyone. Does that make sense? So generally speaking, the bigger your sample, probably more representative, but that's not always the case, right? So like, if I want to study, again, people with HIV, right? And, you know, like the only way that I can get participants is to recruit participants with HIV at a university, right? I can get a bunch of people, especially if I'm at a large university, but getting more people in that context might not increase how representative my sample is, because I'm still looking at probably 18 to maybe 30-year-olds, right? So if I want it to be truly representative, I got to get out in the community and get folks from, I don't know, 18 to 70, right? So, you know, having a larger sample helps a little bit, right? But it's not always like a black and white rule, right? This is why sampling is so important. Sampling in and of itself is like an art, right? If you do it right, it can tell you a lot. If you do it wrong, it almost becomes meaningless, Okay. So for example, in a presidential election, if you go and you poll people from Alabama and you go, hey, who are you voting for? The Republican or Democratic candidate, right? No offense to Alabama, but they're probably voting Republican, right? So you can't go and, so let's say you get 50 Alabamans, they vote Republican, and you go, ooh, that's a small sample. I'm gonna get 2,000 Alabamans instead. Is it now more representative of the United States? No, your sample got bigger, but you know, in terms of representativeness, it hasn't done that, right? So you can do it very carefully. You can still get 200 people, but if you like divided these people into different states that tend to run Republican or Democrat, even at 200, you might have a much better representative sample than someone who's taken a sample of 5,000 Californians, for example, right? So again, a sample is a subset of a population, okay? Most of the time, we won't get data on a population. It's just not possible, right? So oftentimes you take a sample and we want the sample to look like everyone we're interested in, okay? Now, sampling error is the difference between the population mean and the sample mean, okay? So we take a sample and we assume it looks like the population, but the difference between those two is the sampling error, right? It's the part that we fail to capture in our sample. So knowing the sample size, the margin of error for opinion polls helps you to decide its utility. That's why every poll that you look at has like, okay, 48% are voting for Biden, right? 50% are voting for Trump. And then you look at the margin of error and it's like 40 or 4%. Well, the difference between those two is 2 percentage points. If the margin of error is 4%, that poll is meaningless, right? Because it could swing either direction there. So knowing the sample size, knowing the margin of error helps you to determine whether or not an opinion poll is valid or whether or not it has some type of utility. Right? So that idea will come back time and time again. What's the sample? What's the population? What's the sample? What's the population? Understanding the difference between those two, really important. Okay? So in psychology, probably one of the toughest things that we have to do is to come up with an operational definition. So in psychology, this is really difficult because behavior's kind of hard to define, right? So let's say I'm a researcher and I'm interested in whether long distance couples are more in love than couples who are non-long distance. Huh? Right. Were you more in love while you were apart? Now, is that conflated with the fact that you've been together for 5 years? So if he went away now and lived in a different state, you would love him more. It's like a real life experiment. Okay, that's fair. So here's the thing. All right, so if I'm studying this, right, there are a couple of things I have to define, right? One, what is love? Right? If your question is, are people more in love in a long distance relationship than not, right? How do you define love? What is love? And how about in terms of behaviors, right? So what are things that people do when they're in love? Like, how do you know someone loves you? Not your parents, because they have to, right? But give me an example. Okay, so love is giving good, straightforward advice. So what if I'm in a relationship where my partner never comes to me for advice? Does that mean that I am not in love? Okay, fine. Okay, so that's one dimension. Okay, so to measure how much someone's in love, you go over the last month, how often has your partner asked you for advice? And so you have this range. If people score in the low range, they're in love. If they score on the high range, they're not in love. Is that fair? If that's how you define love, I mean, it's fair. It could be one part of love, right? But certainly that can't be the whole thing. That's a cop out, right? You can't do that as a researcher. Then how do you measure love then if you're a researcher? Right? You go, oh, it's just different for everyone. Like happiness. What? I can't study happiness now because happiness is different for everyone? Okay. It does, right? So that's where you kind of have to be careful, right? Are the things that you measure going to represent the thing that you're interested in? So for example, if you're in love, if you're next to that person, you should, like your heart maybe is elevated, right? Maybe your palms are sweaty, right? Knees are weak, right? Whatever else, there's spaghetti. It's mama spaghetti, right? Or something. So for example, if you want to go like, hey, I want to measure love by taking physiological measures, right? Like if you're with someone, you should feel these certain ways. That's good for the most part, right? But like, what else makes your heart race? And what else makes your palms sweaty? Being nervous. Maybe you're just nervous next to this person or scared, right? And so that's why sometimes some of the measures are kind of problematic, right? So my point is, love is very, very hard to define. So every researcher who studies love is going to define love in a certain way, right? Let's do the easier one, okay? What's a long distance relationship? Different zip codes? Different states, okay? Let's start with there. So what if you live like in two cities that are like right next to each other, but they happen to be divided by a border, like a state border? Are you in a long distance relationship? How many hours? More than one. Okay, so here in San Marcos would be long distance. By miles, okay? Miles. How many miles? Yes. I know because I drive back to Arizona. It's a long drive. It's a long drive. But like, for example, if you like, speaking of Texas, if you live in El Paso and your partner lives in Juarez, right? That's two countries. But they're so close to each other, right? It's like you can literally see the other city from one place to the next, right? So what's a long distance relationship? Okay, so what in your mind was like, okay, this is definitely a long distance relationship? Okay, so what if you just like work like a daytime job, they work a nighttime job, and you don't see each other for days at a time? Is that a long distance relationship? Ah, you went back. You're copping out. You're like, oh, it's whatever that person thinks. It's a long distance relationship. Yeah, okay. So you just go, okay, how far is too far? What's long distance relation? What are you?
Combination of measurements.
Okay.
It's, to go what you just said about working 7 shifts. There's, how much you expect to see that person versus how much you get to see that person.
Okay.
How you value quality time.
Okay.
There's 6 hours versus 45 minutes.
Right.
How much do you want to see that person versus how much you want to see that person? It's too far to one side of the spectrum. Then you can say it's long distance.
Yeah, fair. Okay. My point here is that you as the researcher, you just have to tell people how you measured it, right? People can disagree with you, but you just have to tell people. So in my paper, we define long distance relationship as a longer drive than 1 hour. Boom, right? Is it the best definition? No, but that's how I define it. So back off, bro. Like if you want to define it with like how many miles, fine, do it, right? We define long distance relationship as the number of miles on Google measured on Google Maps. Boom, right? Fine. We define long distance as the number of times we get to see each other, or our partners get to see each other. That's fine. But my point here is that a definition, an operational definition, is really important because it defines how you're going to measure that and how you're going to make that comparison, right? And psychology is complex. There's like no perfect definition. So when you define it in a certain way, you just have to tell people, and then you have to be open to their criticism, right? You go, I defined it by an hour's drive. Well, that seems like a bad measure because what if it's 55 minutes, right? What if it's an hour in the snow versus an hour along the coastal highway, right? It's fine. You just tell people, and you kind of have to be open to their criticism of you, right? And hopefully they come up with a better one. If you're going to criticize me, you better offer something better, right? Or at least an alternative. Right? So operational definitions are really important in research, right? Because it tells researchers how you intend to measure the phenomenon that you're interested in studying. Okay. And descriptive statistics, we're going to do plenty of it. They help researchers summarize data. Okay. If you have a large data set, you can kind of summarize that data by one number. That's a descriptive. Like in this class, we have a bunch of different ages. If I go, the average age of this class is 25. That's a type of descriptive statistic, right? Most of students in here are female. That's a descriptive. That's a measure of mode, right? What's occurring most often. So if I can summarize a set of data with 1 or 2 numbers, that's a descriptive statistic. Right? 55% of you guys are single. I don't know. I just made that up, right? But that's one way that I can summarize a bunch of data in one number. Okay. All right. Let's end there. I think we ended 3:15, right?